Thank you very much, Radhika, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be joining this panel. I'm going to be starting with a quote from Tony Blair, believe it or not my favourite person, of course. Shortly after 9/11, he said in a speech, "The kaleidoscope has been shaken, the pieces are in flux. Before they settle again, let's reorder the world around us." It seems to me that this is a particularly apt description for what is going on at present around the Ukraine crisis. Of course, it was after 9/11 that Bush stepped up to seize the multipolar moment, but instead this was to founder with the inevitable advance of a multipolar world. From a pattern of one dominant superpower with four major powers, the EU, Japan, Russia, China, over the next 20 years, we saw a more even five-power balance, particularly with the rise of China, which endeavored then to draw the EU and Japan in through the Belt and Road Initiative. With the US struggling to maintain its dominant position, it began to shift towards a strategy of China containment. And the Ukraine crisis is now the catalyst speeding up long-term trends. The NATO 2030 report, which was issued last year, set out the agenda: Russia first, then China. Now, Blinken and Biden have made absolutely clear for the US, support for Ukraine is not just about European security, it's part of an epic global battle against so-called autocracy. This moral crusade is unfolding in a multi-pronged strategy which is dividing and destabilizing the world. Firstly, there's the renewal and reinforcing of the original NATO project to keep Germany down, Russia out, and the US in, and now drawing NATO allies and partners closer together, extending its reach across Europe into Asia, bringing them all together in a 40-country strong coalition committed to the weapons and sanctions approach aiming at breaking Russia. Secondly, the crisis is being used to overcome any remaining resistance to militarization. Both Germany and Japan, the former Axis powers, are remilitarizing. Then there's the ending of the long-standing non-alignment in Finland and Sweden. And before this, the arms control system suffered a serious blow with the ending of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019. The third prong of the strategy is the creation of a new rules-based order in which only democracies would be deemed legitimate, which is aimed at undermining the UN and ending the one China policy. Now we see the US seeking to provoke China over Taiwan as it did Russia over Ukraine, ignoring the fact that whilst Ukraine is a sovereign state, Taiwan is a part of China. And of course, Taiwan is strategically placed at the center of the chain of US military bases, which reach from Japan, obviously through Okinawa, all the way down to Australia, which are aiming to block China off from the Pacific and prevent it from playing a full role in the region to which it belongs. UN recognition of Taiwan as a part of China is the main obstacle to US isolation of China from the world, and a new rules-based order would allow recognition of a democratic Taiwan as a sovereign independent state. Now, from the vantage point of my country, Britain, which lies at the heart of nuclear-armed NATO, it's clear to see the full global potential of the US NATO China containment strategy, stretching out like a python to squeeze at the key channels of China's growing influence. First, there's AUKUS. Britain, of course, is a member of this. And this AUKUS is building Australia up as a massive forward base for the US military, as well as a nuclear submarine base. In this way, it will serve as the southern anchor of the Pacific chain of military bases that I mentioned before, blocking off the maritime route of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Secondly, the land route of the BRI across Eurasia may well be contained by a new Japan-Germany military partnership. Nuclear weapons backup is to come from the US base at Lakenheath in Suffolk, where we're seeing the return of US nuclear warheads to our soil. This base at Lakenheath will enable the flexible and efficient deployment of nuclear weapons across Europe. Then finally, a couple of weeks ago, we had a surprise appearance of US and French nuclear submarines at our nuclear base at Faslane in Scotland, raising the prospect of a new NATO nuclear base as a jumping off point to the Arctic, no doubt linked in a new NATO presence in Finland and Sweden. This, all lest China open up a new trade route as the ice cap melts. So in other words, under the cover of the Ukraine crisis, long-term plans to cut off China's key land and sea routes are unfolding at a rapid rate as it gains and strengthens its military links under the NATO umbrella. So the empire is indeed turning the kaleidoscope to disorganize the five-power pattern, seizing the moment to crush Russia and isolate China, and to subject Europe and Japan to a new US military hegemony, whilst also seeking to head off any newly emerging poles of power, for example, by endeavoring to incorporate India. Boxing off Russia and China together, the aim is to recenter as much of the rest of the world as possible around the US, which is restored in power through the revival of its military and fossil fuels industries and its weaponization of finance. So I would argue that the target of this division or bifurcation is actually to finish off the UN. However, instead of a division between so-called democracies and autocracies, what we see is a deepening divide between the West and the rest. The large number of abstentions on UN motions to condemn and isolate Russia, the widespread reluctance to apply sanctions, the cool responses to Biden's diplomatic overtures has generated new talk of a non-aligned movement. But first of all, we need to consider why countries in the global south are increasingly reluctant to follow US leadership. And there are many reasons at play, but to what extent are these shaping up into a coherent, non-aligned opposition? So first of all, why this disaffection? Well, the chaotic departure of NATO from Afghanistan for one, and the unreliable nature of the US political system and its foreign policy for another. Then, of course, the shock of US weaponization of finance. If the US is able to block Russia from the world financial system, it could easily do so to others who might not wish to conform to US policies. The US says every country is free to choose, but its moral crusade is really a coerced alignment which restricts other countries' national sovereignty. And added to this are real fears of being caught, like Ukraine, in a proxy war, as the US announces plans to push Russia and China out of Latin America, Africa, the Caribbean, as well as dividing Asia. And then, of course, there's the rising prices of food and energy, the last straw on top of COVID, climate change, poverty and debt, in the failure of the world as it currently operates under US-led institutions to work to support the needs of developing countries. A new non-aligned movement, however, needs to go beyond saying no. The world disorder is of such a scale as to demand not only a complete renewal of UN principles for the sake of peace, but a completely new arrangement of world institutions, as well as an alternative to the US dollar-based financial system. Faced with this massive agenda, it is sobering to think that the combined economies of the 20 top developing countries, including China, is just half that of the combined economic weight of the top 20 developed countries. Even as the US superpower has weakened over recent decades, the third world or global south has become less united, fragmented between the BRICS, the emerging economies, the large developing economies, and the impoverished least developing ones. And there's been an absence of coordination to promote development. Within the BRICS, there's been a tendency to advance their own regional power and status, the idea of multipolarity conflating with a kind of big power chauvinism, to which I would argue Putin fell prey in ordering the invasion of Ukraine. A multipolar agenda has to transcend power rivalries. Nation states have to challenge populist factionalism and look to end neoliberal short-termism and instead encourage longer-term state planning for development, building on regional complementarities and South-South cooperation. At the core of the struggle in the world is the race to the frontiers of the fourth industrial revolution, redistributing the new industries, high-tech industries, renewable energy, and so on, from the global north to the global south. And this could provide the basis for the change of the global financial system. So we need to strategize. We need to make a sober assessment of strengths and weaknesses, distinguishing between objective conditions and subjective consciousness. We need to clearly differentiate between multipolarity, anti-imperialism, and counter-hegemony. A counter-hegemonic strategy would exploit contradictions between the imperialist powers in order to head off world division. China, for its part, is urging Europe to strengthen its strategic autonomy whilst integrating Japan into the framework of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. At the same time, it is advancing a double proposal: the Global Development Initiative to counter the decoupling trend, and the Global Security Initiative to counter a new Cold War division. And these, to my mind, offer a starting place for a fragmented global south to move forward towards long-term world transformation. As Mao said, a 1,000 li march starts with a single step. Thank you.